Good morning, and welcome to today's webcast, NetSuite Controls and Compliance Strategies. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thank you for viewing our webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And with that, I am pleased to introduce today's presenters, Paul Staz, Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Strongpoint, and Labi Rabiu, partner at Moss Adams. Paul has many years of experience in business development and revenue growth. He's a determined and innovative sales leader who can be credited for helping to expand Strongpoint's sales and marketing team and growing the company into a successful compliance and data security solutions provider. Labi has worked in strategy, selection, and implementation of enterprise systems across multiple industries since 1997. He's a certified consultant with expertise in diverse ERP implementations, has an accomplished record of managing business process automation projects, and is a chartered accountant knowledgeable in accounting and operational functions. Prior to joining Moss Adams, Labi spent over 10 years working in IT strategy and compliance roles at national IT consulting companies. And with that, I will turn it over to Labi to get us started.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And hi, everyone. We welcome you all to our presentation today. And thanks for making the time. For our agenda today, we'll start with a quick overview of the control framework available natively in NetSuite. Then we'll dive into the access management features, the financial control features, as well as the change management features, and discuss the risks and leading practices around each of those areas. Then I'll hand it off to Paul to give an overview of how you can automate the control framework available in NetSuite using Strongpoint. Clients are often unaware of the key control features native to NetSuite that can be very easily configured to meet their needs. As the first and the most mature cloud ERP system in the marketplace, NetSuite is rich in features that enable compliance with relevant internal and regulatory controls such as SOX. And enabling these the right way can help ensure that your organization's exposure to risk is limited. These features can be set up to ensure stronger controls around access to the system, around financial processes, and around change management. The controls can then be monitored using NetSuite's real-time reporting and chain tracking features, such as the system notes. We're going to dive into the details of these and the leading practices around them. But before we do that, I thought maybe we should take our first poll. Emily?
All right, our first polling question. What are your biggest controls and compliance gaps? And your options are A, configuration of roles and permissions, B, tracking changes, C, segregation of duties, or D, data security. We'll give everyone a moment or two here to make your selection. Just another couple seconds here. All right, let's go ahead and see what everyone has to say. Labi, back to you.
Oh, thank you, Emily. And I see here, well, we have a fairly sizable representation for segregation of duties, as well as configuration of roles and permissions. And that is right on point, because we're going to be covering those topics in the course of this presentation. Managing access to NetSuite requires being aware of the risks related to logging into the system. And it also requires an awareness of the risks related to poorly segregated roles and permissions. We're going to be discussing access management risks and leading practices under these two categories. So let's start with login access. Login features in NetSuite include ease of access by email and password. You only need a browser and your login name and password to access the system. The system supports setting up of password controls, and you can set up password policy, password length, and password expiration. But there are risks inherent in this. The first login risk is that browser-based access creates opportunity for unwanted intrusion, especially if users are not careful enough with their password. For many NetSuite customers that we've run into, there's a lack of strong password control. The default login is usually just by email and password. And oftentimes, when they have the password controls enabled in NetSuite, the password policy length, expiration, and timeout setting are very lax. The risk is magnified when you don't have additional means of authenticating the system, such as two-factor authentication or IP address restriction. Another risk worth mentioning is that NetSuite data is accessible from multiple environments, which means when you terminate access, you have to terminate it from all environments. And companies often have no defined process for timely removal of employees or contractors' access to production. Besides, there is very often, a sandbox environment available, which, when refreshed, will be a mirror image of the production environment, and it may have a different login and password. So what that means is that if you terminate an employee's access, they may still be able to access your company data in a sandbox environment, and you may be unaware of that. And you may also recall that for those who are familiar with NetSuite twice annual release schedule, there will be a release preview environment that's usually made available 2 times a year for about 2.5 months. And that's accessible to anyone with access. So what that means is that if you have an employee that's terminated around the same time that NetSuite captured that release preview environment, that employee may still have access to your release preview instance. And so those are risks that you need to be aware of. So what are the leading practices to overcome these risks? The first thing you want to do is to enable strong password controls. I mean, that's an obvious thing enough. Password expiration, minimum password length, idle timeout, those settings have to be very strong. But in addition to that, you want to establish, additional login access protection for NetSuite. And you could do that with any of the 3 options listed here. SAML-based single sign-on into NetSuite using a single sign-on tool like Okta or OneLogin. You can enable two-factor authentication, which requires users to log in with not just their email address and password, but also a hard or soft token that generates a one-time numeric password. Or you could do that by enabling NetSuite IP address restriction and VPN, which would only allow people with access to your VPN to access NetSuite. Secondly, you should implement scripts to automatically expire access for contractors who are working with you for just a set period, so that when the project is over, their access is immediately terminated. And it's a simple script that you can set up. And by the way, if you have the Suite People module, which is NetSuite's native HR human resource management module, you can actually establish a process for timely removal of departing employees for each of your environment. And this is done by setting the start and end dates on the employee record to designate when an employee can access the system. And that's a feature that's available standard on the Suite People. So doing all of this will go a long way in securing login access in NetSuite. So I mentioned earlier that access management risks and leading practices can be discussed under two categories. We covered login access. The second category would be roles and permissions. NetSuite has multiple predefined roles and permissions pre-built into the system. These predefined roles are available for your use and will depend on the module that you have provisioned. What you see would depend on which modules you purchased. But with this also comes some risks. And in terms of risk, the main consideration for these standard roles is that they are not necessarily compliant with proper segregation of duties rules. There are multiple conflicts inherent in standard NetSuite roles. It therefore requires implementation of SOD-compliant roles and permission framework to define custom roles and assign permissions based on proper segregation of duties. The other risk is that NetSuite allows multiple roles to be assigned to each employee, with the possibility that one role may counteract another. So if you've, for example, restricted access with one role, but the employee is assigned other roles, one of those other roles may grant access that you restricted. NetSuite also allows global permissions, which, if enabled, will override role-based permissions. Global permissions can be assigned directly under the employee record, and that allows the employees to bypass the restrictions in the roles you've assigned to them. So what that means is that global permissions should be used with extreme caution. So let's touch on the leading practices with NetSuite roles and permissions. The first is to institute a process for requesting and approving access. That means putting in place access request documentation. It means reviewing all access requests for appropriateness to the job function before you sign off on the access. And it also means assigning access only after it's been approved by the business process owner. Secondly, we recommend that you implement segregation of duties, compliant roles and permissions in NetSuite to remediate the conflicts in the standard NetSuite roles. That requires identifying and documenting mitigating controls where you may have staffing constraints that preclude remediation. And it also means using system nodes. You could create custom safe search reports to track assignment and changes to role permissions and what role has been assigned to an employee. Another recommendation is to perform periodic audits, periodic management reviews, so that inappropriate access can be immediately identified and remediated. That means annual review of active role assignments and permissions, quarterly review of role assignments and permission changes, focusing on critical permissions and your business-defined rule sets. And one major recommendation is to consider implementing a solution like Strongpoint. Strongpoint is a risk-based access review and SOD analysis platform for NetSuite. Strongpoint has its own library of rules and pre-built controls that you can leverage in an automated manner. And Paul, who's my co-presenter today, will be touching on this later in the presentation. You should establish a process for timely termination of access when an employee departs or is terminated. That means immediate termination of critical access, like general access users, And for less critical access, like the employee center users who only have the ability to put in expense reports or approve expense reports and or purchase requests, you should, upon notification from HR, move swiftly to remove their access as well. So before we wrap up the access management section of our presentation today, I just want to share one final word of caution on admin access, because we see this a lot of times with clients, with several individuals having admin access. Admins can do harm. So what that means is you want to closely monitor all activities by admin users via the audit trail and system notes reports. Admin access should be removed from all transacting users, and where possible, you should designate admin use for only IT or non-transacting roles. And the leading practice is to maintain at least one backup admin. Ideally, you should have a minimum of 2 admins. And you should consider setting up a light admin role. And in NetSuite, that is called the core administration permission. That's a role you can assign to an IT administrator who's responsible for general administration of NetSuite, but who should not have access to sensitive employee information. We have covered access management controls in NetSuite and how to use them. We share some leading practices, and we'll now turn our attention to financial controls, risks, and leading practices around those. Financial process controls are available in NetSuite, but they are often not fully deployed. You have accounting preferences that tighten system defaults, that allow duplicate restrictions, that allow you to set credit limit warnings. And you have other system preferences like general preference, where you can set your global company preference and also prevent users from overriding them. We don't often see companies do this. You also have safe search-based email alerts in NetSuite that a lot of clients don't often deploy. And there are approvals and workflows for managing business process controls. We see those being deployed, but usually they require SOX remediation because they've been deployed inappropriately. And there are system notes for tracking changes to records, such as vendor master records. But we don't often see clients tracking those changes. So in terms of risks, the myriad of ways to implement NetSuite controls creates challenges for configuring the system to meet each customer's business needs. You can configure any one of these pre-built controls in NetSuite, but you have to do so in a way that does not create more risks. So for example, one thing we see a lot is that clients create safe searches to alert them to financial information, but they share these safe searches and make them public, thereby sharing unintended sensitive financial information to most users. So for that reason, financial process control needs to be set up with some consideration. And what are these leading practice considerations we share? First is to set up accounting and general preferences per your business requirements. That means setting up system defaults, setting up account defaults to make data entry seamless where possible. It means enabling credit limit warning. It means blocking duplicate transaction numbers and enabling approval handling in NetSuite. And all of these are available under the accounting and general preference settings in the system. It means enabling restrictions to prevent changes to company preferences. So if you've enabled duplicate number warning and credit limit warning, those should be restricted from user override. That means you need to check the allow override checkbox. You need to verify that the allow override checkbox on the general preferences is not checked, because if you check it, then users can override your global settings. We also recommend that you set up safe search-based email alerts for tracking unusual amounts, large balance thresholds, or to alert you to any transactions initiated by someone who should not normally be initiating such transactions. And an obvious point, which we've touched on, is maintaining SOD compliant approval workflows. So your requisition approval, your vendor bill approval, your journal approval, you want to make sure that those are SOD compliant. So one thing we see very often is that customers set up a journal approval workflow, but users still have the ability to approve their own JE, or the approvers of journal entries have the ability to edit the journal entries and then subsequently post. Those should not be the case. If you've set up your journal approval workflows appropriately and you've designated a JE approval role that is assigned the approval authority to approve journal entries. And we also recommend that you periodically review system notes for tracking transaction forms and lists, such as master record, especially the vendor master record. Continuing, you want to review transaction audit trails. Those are available under the menu Transactions Management View Audit Trails. And it's a standard report in NetSuite that tracks any changes in the system. You want to review that periodically, and we'll touch more on that later on. You want to track transaction deletions and, force users to put in deletion reasons so that users, when they have to delete, they are entering the reasons for deleting, and you can subsequently review those reasons to see if they're valid reasons for deleting transactions. We recommend that you enable posting restrictions. It means assigning permissions to override period restrictions to only designated users to prevent posting to locked periods. We recommend that you enable accounting preference posting period restrictions, which would disallow posting to transaction dates outside of your current posting period. So before we move on to our next topic on the agenda, let's take our next poll very quickly.
All right, our next polling question: have you considered segregation of duties for your roles and permissions? And your options are A, we have not considered it. B, we do not have segregated roles and permissions, but are considering it. C, we have segregated roles and conduct periodic review using NetSuite only. Or D, we have segregated roles and conduct periodic review using another system. So we'll give everyone a moment to think on that. And just another couple of seconds. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Back to you.
Yeah, it's good news. A lot of folks here have segregated roles and conduct periodic review of NetSuite. That's a good thing. And you do that using native NetSuite. As we've explained, the system has a lot of capabilities around that. And there are also other tools to use like Strongpoint that we're going to be touching on later on. Moving on to the last leg of our native NetSuite control areas where you can enable features and follow leading practices. We'll touch on change management risks and leading practices around that. Change management in NetSuite is one of the strongest features available in the system. You have system notes and audit trails which track changes to transactions and reports. I touched on those earlier. You also have system notes to track changes to configuration settings with financial impact. And NetSuite is one of the few solutions in the marketplace that allow that. You also have system notes, safe searches that can track changes to script, workflows, custom fields, and custom forms. So you know who made any changes and when. You also have emails that you can set up as part of NetSuite Safe Search to alert you to provide you real-time notifications and reminders in the system. And in terms of risks, these NetSuite features for auditing changes are often not fully deployed. We see clients allow deletion of transaction record, but not tracking them. We see admin users transacting in the system. We see non-admin users not, having access to Swift script and Swift bundle folders, which are very sensitive folders in the system. And even worse, we see companies without any formal change management process for managing changes to NetSuite and their other enterprise systems. So what are the leading practices we recommend? Well, periodic review of audit reports in NetSuite. Again, this is very important. Audit trail available throughout the system forms are there and also now available for configurations. You can track, you can set up custom safe searches to track any transaction by admin users or any changes to vendor master record or any changes at all by any users. And very importantly, NetSuite twice annual release should be tested in the new release preview environment that NetSuite provides for you. So you want to conduct an impact assessment to determine your testing requirements, and then go ahead and test your business process workflows. Test your custom forms and report, because this can be tested as part of your regular business process flow testing. And if you have any customizations, such as custom scripts or custom integrations, you want to test those as well. And you also want to maintain a change management program to require authorization and ticketing system for any changes to NetSuite. And then ensure that there is testing for those changes, meaning you have to have test plan, test result, and sign-offs. An appropriate approval prior to those changes being migrated from sandbox environment or development environment to production. And once those changes are made in the system, you want to have safe searches to alert you to any changes post-release. So finally, we'll just quickly touch on this tool that a lot of folks are not aware of. NetSuite has an administration and controls toolkit, which, when set up, allows the administrator to have a compliance dashboard for real-time monitoring of NetSuite controls. Administrator can monitor failed login attempts or successful login attempts. They can monitor roles and permission changes. They can monitor via that dashboard any changes to system forms and configuration. They can monitor changes to scripts or system notes, and they can also monitor changes to workflows. And those are auditable via the history tab. And so a lot of people are unaware of this tool. You should reach out to your NetSuite provider or partner, as the case may be, to inquire about this, because it's something that you can provision and use and have your admin use to monitor and ensure compliance to controls. And here's just a sample screen of what the administration and control toolkit's dashboard looks like. And with that, we'll go on to our next poll before we hand it off to Paul to go through the Strongpoint part of the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Our third poll here: when considering controls and compliance, does your organization prefer A, using internal resources to manually leverage native tools from NetSuite, B, using a NetSuite partner to create and implement, C, leveraging a third-party tool to help automate the process, or D, all of the above? Give everyone some time to think about that. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. And Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Labi. And I would say that these results are pretty much in line with what we see. It's kind of a mixed bag, and I find that a lot of it will depend on kind of the maturity level of the organization and how long they've had NetSuite, how many partner relationships they've been able to develop over the years, how much in-house expertise they have. There's a bunch of different factors or variables that can come into play. But appreciate the responses on the polls. I think we're on time here. We've got about 16 minutes left. And so what I'll do is walk you through a couple of quick slides. I'll share a short demo, and then we'll save some time for questions. I know a few have come in already, and we will get to those answers for you. And so what I'll cover here is how you can automate some of what Labi reviewed. The first thing that we'll cover is how you can treat changes differently by type. Secondly, how you can, manage those or, wrap process around them. So things like change requests and approvals and reporting. And then lastly, I will jump into segregation of duties and compensating controls. And a lot of what you'll see in my presentation here really does come back to managing configuration, managing customization, and managing access. It's a lot of what Labi covered, and it's a lot of what came out in those first two polls, where people are interested in segregation of duties. It's obviously important to you, and people are also interested in how you can effectively manage roles and permissions. So first thing is change process by type. And so Strongpoint is a managed bundle that's built inside NetSuite, and you'll download and install, and a lot of this stuff comes out of the box pretty much ready to go. And what this policy record enables you to do is go through and select which types of changes require process. So what I mean by that is that you can say low risk changes don't require process. They don't need approvals. So for example, if somebody in production is going to create a saved search, there's no approval required for that. However, if somebody's going to go off and edit a workflow or create a new script, there might be a much more rigorous process for that. And so by type, you can go through and select it. So we typically see low risk, medium risk, where you want a change request and an approval in place, but you don't necessarily need to see, a full software development lifecycle with sandbox testing and development and QA and peer review and things of that nature. And then you'll see high risk changes where you do require that full software development lifecycle. You might have two different stages of approval, for example, where you've got a business decision and a review and an approval to build, and then more of a technical process followed by a final approval to deploy. And you need to actually have proof of those two different approvals before that change makes its way into production if it's going to be deemed compliant. Right? And so Strongpoint allows you to implement that quickly and to operationalize it using change request tools, approval tools, and reporting. And so that's really the next thing that I'll just talk on quickly. So a couple of different formats that we provide out of the box. We've got an interface that's built for you for the addition, removal, and temporary access of roles. So not only is it easy for you to track where roles are being added to users, but you can also automatically tie the approvals for those and the process that was followed for those, reconciling your audit log back to the original approvals. Same thing goes for configuration changes, but a little bit more technical support there, where we also have impact analysis tools that'll help you understand dependencies and technical risk involved with the changes. You can log that testing was done. These changes are all documented automatically for you. We've got tools to validate that deployments were successful between two different environments. So again, change requests and approval tools, but also some technical support as well. But then again, importantly, from a compliance perspective, we have that automated reconciliation where we're creating the audit log or the change logs as you make them, but they're automatically tied back to the approvals. And you don't need to go through and do that or monitor it manually. It's done in a much more automated way. And then I think one of the best features that Strongpoint provides out of the box around this type of change tracking is that you can report based on level of compliance. And I'll show you this in a second, but what we do basically is we automatically flag most of your changes as compliant, right? They were either low risk and didn't require process, and therefore they're automatically compliant, or they were medium or high risk changes, but they followed the right process. There's approvals that are in place. Everybody's done their work. And so those are also flagged as compliant. And what that does is it really minimizes the amount of changes that you need to review. You can review only the exceptions, and that gives you much better visibility to it, but then you're also more likely to respond and actually take action on exceptions because there's a much smaller number of things to be reviewed. And then we have a process that you can use to go through and resolve them. So when you walk into an audit, you can say, this is everything that was done right. These are the things that weren't, but hey, look, we've done all this work already to review them, and here's the supporting documentation. It really does set you up well for running a very controlled environment. And lastly, I'll show you this too. So I'll try to be brief on this slide. But Labi mentioned segregation of duties. There's all kinds of segregation of duties risks in NetSuite. And as he mentioned, the out-of-the-box rules typically come with them. Or out-of-the-box roles typically come with them. And so Strongpoint has a rule library. We've got a lot of these leading practices already built in, and we will automatically scan your environment. We'll automatically alert you to any issues that you might have. And so very literally, you know, in a weekend, you can set it up on Friday, you can come in on Monday, and you can see all of the areas of risk, all of the gaps within your roles, all of your users that may have issues, and so on. So now the one thing that we often see, and I'm sure that this is the case for a lot of those on the call, is that NetSuite teams might be small, right? You might have 10 users, 20 users, 40 users. It's not possible to perfectly separate duties. And so you will often need mitigating controls. And so monitoring for the specific types of activities that you just can't control because you don't have enough people. Labi mentioned things like edits to your vendor master, your customer master, your item master, things of that nature, or tracking administrator activity as it relates to transactional activity specifically, right? People need to have admin access, but if they're ever involved in transactions, you need to see it. Or where people have gone off and bypassed those journal entry related workflows somehow, and they've created and approved their own or edited something after it's been approved. So how can you automatically flag those on an exception basis rather than having to review everything? And that's really what our mitigating controls allow you to do. So I'll share a screen here, and so you'll have a separate window pop up here. And if for some reason you can't see it, somebody let me know in the chat or something like that, but it should pop up for you in just a second. And so I'll show you Strongpoint. I spoke to this a little bit already, so I'll be brief, but we have our policy record built inside NetSuite, and it will allow you to go through and create policies for different types of changes. So you can say complex changes like scripts and formulas and workflows require more extensive approvals and process. You know, configurable objects like searches and reports may not, or the addition of new fields or edits to fields may not. Changes to user roles or settings and preferences or the assignment of roles can require higher levels. We do have some built kind of default best practices or leading practices that we can provide here, but these are very customizable. And then what this gives you the ability to do is to leverage our pre-built change and approval processes. And so for this one, for example, this is a ticket that we've opened to assign me the AP clerk role because my VP of sales and marketing role isn't working out. As soon as you go in and you select the employee and you select the role that you want to assign, remove, or provide temporary access for, it'll automatically let you know which of your policies apply, what level of change control is required, who needs to approve it. And then once this is approved by the proper approver, it would automatically be assigned, automatically be removed, or we would provide that temporary access for you. Okay. Now, the same goes for configuration changes, where you'd be able to go in and instead of calling out the user and the role, you'd be able to provide a list of customizations that are going to be changed or added as part of this ticket. And then the same process will happen, where Strongpoint will look at it, we'll do an impact analysis for you. We'll say there's no technical risk associated with these two. However, these other three over here do have more risk. Here are some warnings. Here are the dependencies that you need to be concerned with. These are the approvers that are required. Here's the process that's required. In this case, it's a full software development lifecycle, and I think you can see why, because there's dependent scripts that you need to be concerned with. There's a dependent managed bundle and a number of dependencies. Quick comments here just to answer some questions. You can integrate this with other ticketing systems. So we have pre-built integrations with Jira, ServiceNow, Zendesk, as well as NetSuite cases. And so you'd actually have all of that show up on this related change records tab. So it would say, this came from Jira, this is the ticket number, here's a link to that ticket. And a lot of this activity can be done in Jira. You can keep your existing approval processes, and then our audit reporting would link all the way back to that Jira ticket. So you can see where all of that was done. So that's a good question, Ken, but definitely something that we come across pretty often. I'll talk quickly on the change reporting. So this is what we call our open non-compliant change report. And so what this is going to be is your exceptions. It's going to show you things that didn't follow your process and that were high risk. And so here we're seeing a bunch of Suitelet scripts and things like that and workflows that are being deployed. We've got short little summaries of what the changes were, but we also have very detailed change logs on all of this in the background. And then what you can do is go through and provide resolution descriptions. You can close them off, link them back to other kind of approved tickets, but done after the fact. And so it gives you that list of exceptions that you can parse through. Coming back to a question from earlier, and it related to administrator access and configuration changes, but this is a great way to track those types of things because you can also drill in by user. It is very common for partners to require administrator access based on our experience, and this is a really good way for organizations to track their activity. So we've had customers customize these views a little bit to show just specifically the work that their partners are doing in their environment so they can maintain visibility to it and report back on it easily. So that was a good question from earlier. Segueing, I'll talk a little bit about segregation of duties. I know there's some more questions on this coming too, so we will circle back on them. So Strongpoint out of the box has a library of rules, and the vast majority, if not nearly all of our customers, use exclusively our out-of-the-box rules. And then what they do is they'll go through and they'll filter them down and they'll maybe customize them here and there just to make sure that they only apply to the risks that are applicable to their organization. There's two real kind of formats or structures of our rules. There's what you call a two-sided rule, which is where there's a permission that conflicts with other permission or permissions. So one-to-one or one-to-many. So for example, if you have the permission that allows you to create journal entries, you should not also have the permission to approve journal entries. So we'll go out and we'll sniff through your NetSuite environment, and if those two permissions exist in the same role, we will alert you to it. Or if there's an employee that has multiple roles and those two permissions exist within multiple roles, we will also alert you to that. So it would be like a user-based issue rather than a role-based issue. So we go through, we sniff all of that out, and these are typically quite sufficient from an SOD perspective, and our team helps support you in determining which rules are best for your organization and in reviewing those conflicts for you. And real quick, we follow that same process where you've got compliant incidents, unresolved incidents, and resolved incidents. But what we'll show you basically is that, here's the rule that is being violated. This one is for vendor record and P2P transactions. It's purchase order related, where you can edit certain things on the vendor bill or vendor master and have permission or purchase order related activity. And so what we do is we show you the conflicting permissions, we give you a reason for it, and then you can go through and review and resolve and document and do all of those great types of work. Last thing I'll talk about briefly, and then we'll switch over to questions. We also have a library of compensating controls. So like I mentioned earlier, you can't always perfectly separate duties. This is a great way to track that type of activity. The one that we have down here in the bottom also, for example, is tracking transactional activity by administrators. The differences that we provide here is that we can do some extra filtering, so we can eliminate a lot of the false positives that might just be showing up because of automation. And when we do create these logs, it's an immutable log on the platform, can't be modified, can't be deleted even by administrators. And then again, we have that whole compliant, unresolved, resolved process. So you give your teams tools and processes to actually work through these. Set up really well for audit in a fraction of the time. So for those that are new to Strongpoint, I hope that was at least, well, while it was brief, I hope it was a good overview, just to give you a sense of what we do. I think Labi covered a ton of the leading practices and key risk areas. And I hope that gives you an idea of kind of how an out-of-the-box tool can set you up to implement those and then manage them on an ongoing basis in a lot less time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and maybe we jump through a couple of those final questions.
All right. I think, Paul, you answered some of the questions that came in already. We can squeeze in one more. Let's go with, how does one ensure that all potential SOD issues within NetSuite are identified?
Yeah, I can take that very quickly and let Paul weigh in. What we usually recommend is clients, as I explained during the presentation, do a periodic review. That means downloading the role-based permission listing, going through that very carefully to identify any conflicts. But that requires knowledge of what the SOD rules are, such as a user shouldn't be entering journal entries and approving their own entries, or someone who's putting in PO should not be the one receiving the goods. Now, if you want to go through a more automated way, so if you don't have the necessary SOD knowledge to identify those conflicts, then you can leverage a tool like Strongpoint, where you have pre-built rules already that just matches your permission listing against the pre-built rules and spits out all of the conflicts. And Paul, you might want to just jump in on that as well.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I'm biased, but don't try to do it all yourself. Leverage the expertise of NetSuite partners. I mean, tools like Strongpoint are obviously very valuable here. I think that the key here in the question is that I think it is possible, with a little help, to identify all issues that are identified. And I think the real challenge often comes back to actually resolving the underlying problems. So it's one thing to know, hey, I have an SOD issue over here. It's another thing to go in and understand, like, is it a real issue or is it a false positive? Are people actually performing that type of activity? Could I switch that permission back to view instead of edit and resolve it? And so I think that that's where you should focus, is not just identifying the SOD issues, but actually resolving the underlying issues. I think that's what you should be striving for, because if not, you're just bogged down in periodic reporting that takes up a lot of time all the time.
Great, thank you. We are out of time for questions. If you submitted a question today and we didn't get to it, we will do our best to follow up with you after the presentation. Thank you so much, Paul and Labi, for a great presentation today. Here's a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey, as your feedback is very important to us. And thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.